Livewire, in association with We Are No Platform for Peace. We Are No, a conflict prevention strategy and initiative.
Good evening and welcome to KTN Livewire. This is your post-election show, if you like. And tonight, we just want to go back to the basics. What happened before the elections, during the elections, and after the elections? Where we are right now, this is auditing the elections, if you like. In studio with me, I have a panel of lawyers just to help me do that. Allow me to introduce them. Kibe Mungai, thank you very much for making time.
My pleasure.
Charles Kanjama, nashukuru sana.
Delighted to be here.
And Harun Dubi.
Good evening.
All right, we will just in a second be going back to the details, but first, let's set the stage for this show.
I, in particular, want to thank my older brother, Raila Odinga, for his spirited campaign. I know that all candidates have made tremendous personal sacrifices for the progress of our country. And today, I welcome them to join us in moving our nation forward.
This crisis is not just about the IEBC. It's a crisis in the very workings of the faith that Kenyans have placed in their institutions to respect their democratic rights and the rule of law. It is democracy that is on trial.
The same God who gave us victory against the odds
Mungu yule aliyetupa ushindi licha mambo yale mengi
will give or will do
atatenda
exceedingly,
zaidi
abundantly,
kautende
more than what the people of Kenya want.
When we sing in the words of our national anthem, justice be our shield and defender, haki iwe ngao na mlinzi. If ever there was a time, a moment in our country's history where those words sound so relevant, it is now.
Indeed, that's where we are. This is elections on trial. Gentlemen, karibu sana. Let me start with you, Kibe. We've done the elections, it's over, it's done and dusted, perhaps. What are just the initial feeling of the election that we just conducted?
Well, my initial feelings is that this is the greatest moment of democracy in this country. And I say this in the knowledge that since multipartyism resumed in 1992, we've never had another chance when Kenyans were able at least to get half of the valid votes being cast in favor of one presidential candidate. I think for me the fact that the presidential candidate announced as president-elect was part of a coalition that has won substantial seats in the National Assembly, for me that was a great moment for Kenya. And of course, and I congratulate Kenya in saying this, the fact that that particular result was secured against the backdrop of extensive and serious intimidations of Kenyans, I think it is a big victory for the sovereignty of our country. I was proud to be a Kenyan. I am still proud that at least when it comes to voting, we don't give a damn who tells us whom we can vote for and whom we cannot. Therefore, I'm proud today that despite threats that this or the other can happen, the people of Kenya were freely able to make their choices, and I believe that the results announced by the IEBC are a clear and correct manifestation of the will of the people of Kenya.
All right, clear and correct manifestation of the people of Kenya. Charles, is that your feeling also?
Smart, what I loved about the election period really was the turnout. I think it was the first time that Kenyans have come out in such large numbers, 86% or thereabouts, to cast their votes. We do know that there were challenges with voter registration. Not all Kenyans who had been targeted, 18 million, registered to vote. But of the 14.3.4 million who registered to vote, 86% came out to cast their votes. And when you look at the voter turnout figures, you notice high voter turnout across the country. I think that is something that is very inspiring. That is something that Kenyans can take home from these elections. One of the things I loved was to see the long queues of Kenyans waiting patiently, persuaded and convinced that democracy works, that they can play their role. And I think that was a good beginning for the Kenya of the new constitution.
Harun?
Well, may I join my friends in congratulating Kenyans for voting peacefully. But it is important that we look at these elections in the context of what happened in 2007, and especially the assessment that was done by Johan Kriegler and what he told us in his report, that there were certain things that were not done right by the defunct ECK that ought to have been done right. In that context of what we're calling the turnout, as mentioned by my colleague Charles here, I would like to go back to 2002, when there was also a huge turnout at the time, and also at the referendum of 2010, where there was also a huge turnout. Both times, 2010 and 2002, the turnout was not more than 73%. Getting a genuine turnout of close to 80, not past 80, close to 80 is a huge of an ambitious task. So when you find a turnout that goes beyond 80 to 87, that is as suspect as the turnout can be 90%, over 90% in Zimbabwe. So there are questions. In fact, my own assessment is that the IEBC, save for the patience of Kenyans, the IEBC performed worse than the ECK in terms of the overall management of this election, notwithstanding their desire that Kenyans accept that result, notwithstanding the basis upon which we are saying, because of the peace we had, let's go on the way we are, we're going and accept the result. The other interesting and significant thing I think I would like to note about this election was, if you permit me to use these words carefully but courageously, the apparent conspiracy of the media to be silent, that so long as there is some kind of quiet, therefore there is peace. There are fundamental questions around how the management of the process by IEBC, issues related to citizens being uncomfortable and the disquiet they had around the management and processing of this election. But the media, in that conspiracy, again, on account of seeking to uphold that peace, that quiet, so that we do not get in peril anything, I think chose, and has continues to choose, not to interrogate the system properly to say, really, did IEBC deliver on what we expected? Because if I say this in terms of my final comment in the introduction, after the Constitution, this election of 2013 was the single most important public investment in terms of promotion of democracy. So there needs to be a frank and fair and direct and transparent audit to say, to tell the truth really about what happened around these elections, around the procurement of BVR and the voter identification gadgets called VIDs, about the tallying and transmission of results, whether there was such tallying, whether there was tallying at all, whether there was verification, because the Constitution tells us about what a free and fair election is. Our Constitution is very progressive this time around. It says a free and fair election means and includes it is conducted by an independent body, it is by secret ballot, it is fair, it is accurate, it is verifiable, it is transparent, it is accountable, and many of those catchwords that are captured by the Constitution, those are not of my own making. So I think for me, James, that is the basis. And therefore, in summary, I would tell you that yes, Kenyans conducted themselves peacefully, much the same way we did prior to the announcement of the result of 2007. Kenyans had voted peacefully. I think that is the only thing that happened, is the trust and faith they now have in their institutions. And I've said, if there are any disputes around this result, which disputes existed even in 2007. Now we trust that the institutions we have, that is the judiciary will deal with them, and that is really another plus for Kenyans.
There is something that should not go unchallenged in what you have said, just in 30 seconds.
Please go ahead.
Number one, when he talks about the voter turnout, I think what Kanjama is saying is correct. We should applaud Kenyans for turning out in large numbers. There is nothing suspect about those numbers. In the years 2002, 1997, we've been using a register that was made since 1992. And Kriegler was observing that dead voters constituted anything between 25 to 40% of the old register. So the new register that was being used and was prepared up to 18th of December last year was clearly of people who are alive and who are able to go and vote. Number two, you will notice that in the strongholds, whether you are talking about the CORD strongholds or the Jubilee strongholds, you had turnouts ranging from 85 to about 94. The areas where there were no major contestants is where you had a lower, and this is what has been the trend over time. And therefore, just by themselves, the voter turnout and the number of people who came out voting, it tells no story. The truth of God is, as there is voter turnout, the voting was being read out, we had no complaints of anybody saying that an abnormal figure has been read anywhere. In Siaya, it was read 94%. People expected in Siaya a lot of people to come out, in the same way that I expect Nyeri and Nyandarua should have been expected to turn up. So there is no story there.
All right, we're here today because we conducted those elections, and truth be told, there are questions that are being asked right now. Questions in terms of how it was conducted in the beginning. Say Kenyans come out in large numbers. On that day, start asking the question on that day, up to 10 at night, people were still voting. By 6 or 7, we started getting results of the electronic at Bomas of Kenya. So questions of what should have happened, should have finished. Clearly there was challenges of us voting in the beginning, should have at least ended the voting 9 or 10 or whatever, and say the results would start coming after that, or it was just, you know, one of those things that just happened. Just let me start with you.
Smart, because many Kenyans have followed the American election, I think you can use it as an example, because we had that interest of a son of Kenya vying for the presidency. In America, you know, they actually sometimes even call the election before some of the western states, like California, have finished voting. I don't think it is a strange phenomenon. I think what is critical is at the moment you finish the voting in whichever polling station, you begin counting the votes. And those people on the queue will not be disenfranchised because they'll be allowed to vote. And as you go towards a mature democracy, that is the expectation. Of course, there were criticism that some people were being influenced by the fact that results were being streamed in from some polling stations while they were still on the queue voting. But you can say the same thing about opinion polling. It influences some people. All these theories about numbers, all that could influence you if you are not a mature voter. Mature voters make up their minds and they go with it, whether the numbers seem to be favoring them or not. I think when you study the trends, you would say that it was one of the attempts that was made to ensure that there's no manipulation of votes, to ensure that the moment the voting finished, with the polling agents present, the ballot boxes would be sealed. And in fact, as an observer, I witnessed this. And then after 10 or 15 minutes, they would take the presidential ballot box, secure the ballots from there, and begin the process of sorting and tallying or counting of those ballot papers. That is a good thing, because we have seen in the past that that period between the end of voting and the beginning of tallying is a period which is susceptible to introduction of manipulation. So I think the approach that IEBC adopted was the best approach to ensure that all the observers, all the party agents, all the polling clerks were assured there was no manipulation of the ballot. These votes that were counted were the votes that were cast into the ballot boxes.
Can I say something about in that regard?
Yes.
Especially that actually Charles has put his finger on the heart of the problem. That what Kriegler pointed out is not that it was new to us, we knew it, that one person's vote, one voter's vote needed to count. But how did we secure the integrity of that vote to count? The way to do so was to use what was introduced as the electronic voter, let me call it electronic system, because there are many aspects of the electronic process. Now, the BVR, for instance, in the first instance, was supposed to register you. And the voter identification device, when you went to vote, if it had worked, if you put your thumb there, you were discounted as having voted even at the National Tallying Center through the communication with the server, so that there would be no double voting, so that it would have not been necessary to use the physical hard copy registers. But did they work? A lot of those gadgets, like the telephones that people were given to and use out there, were not even configured, not even charged, I dare say, by the evening of Sunday when some of them got those things. The computers and laptops, and this has been said before, I would like to trust, did not even have standby chargers so that they could last the 12 hours or the 11 hours of voting. And most of you who have used laptops know, if you use your laptop consistently for 1 hour without charging it, the power goes off. So that, if I should speak for myself as an example, when I went to vote at St. George's Primary School, I was on the queue by 6:30, but by 8 o'clock when I voted, and we had a very long queue, the computer was not there. I didn't see a laptop. I went in there, they looked at my ID, got me the ballots, and I voted and left. So the question that integrity of the ballot, which was supposed to be protected by these electronic mechanisms, collapsed from the first day, the first time. We saw at the IBC Tallying Center, the National Tallying Center, especially in regard to the presidential election, the system itself failed. And at one time, IBC had to stop using it and revert to, I think, either manual or non-manual process, which I haven't yet quite understood, of tallying, where they were now expecting the Form 36s, which would be delivered, and they would say, these are the figures we are adding up. Now, of course, there is the other question, and this, I think, the political party agents are the ones to explain even better what complaints they have, where at one point, instead of securing the accuracy of verifying and tallying, because the tallying had to incorporate the element of verification, which is required under the law and the Constitution, the party agents, as well as the accredited observers, were removed from the National Tallying Center and taken to a room separate within Bomas, where they would now be recipients of Form 36s without verification, because as they receive these copies, the Commission is also announcing these results. So, in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that there was the equipment procured did not work. So there is an issue about our investment of the money, but that is not, perhaps it was a debate for today. B, that even where they started to work, they only lasted a few minutes, maybe 1 hour, maybe 2 hours max, and they collapsed. Of course, you remember that Safaricom communicated by letter to IBC explaining that they were not responsible for some of those technical failures. And because I'm not an expert in IT, I don't want to get into great detail about this. But yet, there is another question. Because voting is a process, and you recall the decision of the Supreme Court regarding the gender rule. The Supreme Court said that elections are a continuum. There are a long process, and not one event should be separated from the other. So I go back to the procurement. Something that the public possibly do not know is that the procurement of this equipment was itself adjudged to have been illegal. And the IBC was adjudged by the procurement tribunal, appeals tribunal, that IBC had bent backwards to favor a person who should have provided this service as equipment and service, who did not qualify. And it appeared to that tribunal that there was an interest from inside within the IBC that that company would be favored. So whatever else, this is a company that should have been disqualified on account of the technical procedures and the technical bids assessment. that company would have been disqualified at that time. And this is a finding of the tribunal. No, it's not those are not my words. But because they said it is so late in the day, since we are going to the election, let this procurement proceed in favor of public interest, not the legal issues about how this thing was procured. And one I trailed because those people who provided those equipment had not even demonstrated capacity to deliver on what they were
starting from the question. That is notwithstanding the issues that are coming through, moving on from there, and the issues that are coming through, did the failure of these electronic kits, you know, in the beginning, in the voting itself, started compromising the elections?
Yes, I have a reaction as I try to answer the original question that you asked. In terms of, and because we need to organize elections better as we move on to the future, I would say that in areas like Nairobi, Eldoret, and areas like Nakuru, where you have big populations, I think the organizations of these elections, where you could have avoided these very long queues, probably you should have had more polling stations, because that is what introduced the issue, because the law requires that if at 5 o'clock you are on queue, then you must vote. So that you have a situations where by 5, and because voting did not start early enough, you had even 5,000 people on queue. Those people had to complete voting. Number 2, when it comes to the issue of the voter transmission, now coming now to your question, let us separate issues here. That for purposes of transmitting, for transmitting results, that is where the electronic transmission of results was necessary from the polling stations to the headquarters of the commission. But that one only enhances the credibility of the process. But the legal process that is provided under the rules is that the counting would be done, the result would be entered in specific forms, like with regard to the presidential votes at the polling station here are forms 34, then there would be forms 36 which would be prepared at the headquarters. So if that one is done, and is done properly in accordance with the law, there would be no problem, though it would have been better if these results somehow had been transmitted electronically. Secondly, it is important to point out that the verification, and there was something wrong in my view in the interpretations by the commissions of the 7-day window. I believe that the correct interpretation should be, when you vote, you really do not have 7 days in which you are supposed to give out the results. I think you can read the results as quickly as possible. But even what the agents were trying to do at Bomas was wrong, because I think the moment these forms 36 came, that results had to be read. At least a day or two of whatever else could have been discovered, some form of verifications ought to have been done. But you can imagine the chaos you are going to have when every form is disputed, yet the law, my understanding of the law, is that you complete these disputes, at least the bulk of them, at the polling stations and before at the constituency level, before the returning officers. So that what ought to have been done there, the national agents wanted to do it at Bomas. And that was not acceptable, and it is clearly the law does not permit that kind of things to be done at Bomas, because that is really not what the law provides for. And therefore, for me, that is a lesson. But even if it is a lesson on what ought to be the proper management, I see nothing in the manner in which those events took place that appears to impeach the result. The result is good as it goes.
I think I need to make a correction at the risk of sounding like lawyers submitting before the court. I think there is a legal position that is contested, and Kib is entitled to his point, but the law requires that whereas at the point the presiding officer or the returning officer, whichever of the two, has finished the counting of the votes, it says he shall electronically transmit that result to the National Tallying Center before ferrying that form 36. Those are words used. They shall electronically transform before ferrying.
But they fail.
Look, what I'm saying is this, and that's the point probably we need to be patient with, to understand. What was the purpose of these gadgets? The purpose was to ensure that there is integrity of the ballot, so that you do not have dead people voting, you don't have multiple voting, you don't exclude people from voting, or people voting when they shouldn't be voting. But when it has failed like that, the potential of other persons either voting multiply or dead people coming back to vote through their agents, through living agents, or misbehavior by either an agent or an electoral officer, that would have been taken care of by the equipment, because the necessary software would have necessitated that the additional padding up of votes would be rejected by the national server. Now, because that didn't happen, then what needed to be done physically and manually was to get to the most near perfect pragmatic solution, which would be how to verify. And the verification has an ordinary English meaning. You must say this really exists. If it exists, is it the one that we got from the other side? And perhaps Kibe doesn't know that there are other difficult problems, but because there are cases being filed tomorrow, I may not go into great detail, but I may mention this for your benefit now, that there are situations where those Form 36s, some have emerged from the same constituency with different results, two forms. So that would have led to the issue of verification, would have sorted that out. There are issues about the population of votes, of voters. Indeed, Kibe says there is a register that existed by 18th of December 2012, when we stopped, by law, we stopped voting, registering. But I don't know whether it will surprise you, and I would be pleased if it does surprise you soon, when you will discover that the IEBC actually, up to the time of voting, used 3 versions of registers. And those are versions which you find from their website. They are not a creation of my mind. They are in their website. These registers had different details. Another thing you will find is that the register that was used after 18th December had people who were registered without BVR. And in fact, from their website, you'll find a document which says these are the population of registered voters without BVR after the 18th of December. I know that the law requires and provided for verification of the register after registration. The only thing that can happen, and ought to have happened, but unfortunately didn't, was that you can only reduce the number of people shown on the register if there were double or multiple registrations. There was no requirement, there was no possibility under the law, there was no power under the law to add new voters. But unfortunately, that's what happened.
That's what happened. I'm
amused because I'm feeling as if there's a court lawyer here who's arguing their petition even before it's filed in court. Definitely smart, there are issues that have been raised regarding the integrity of the elections, and those issues need to be scrutinized and investigated by the Supreme Court. I don't think this is the forum to go into them one by one. What I would say just in general is that systems, even the best of systems, fail. Even when you're starting a rocket, you want to set up a rocket to go to the moon or somewhere, you have fallback systems, backup plans. So I think our systems failed. You cannot deny that. The electronic voter identification system failed, not the biometric voter registration, and I think it's important to keep a distinction between that. The question is, did we have adequate fallback mechanisms, and can we have confidence that those mechanisms, when they were utilized, gave us a result with integrity? Harun Dubi thinks that the fallback mechanism had no integrity. It was totally failed, it was totally manipulated.
What do you think?
I think my friend Kibe Mungai thinks the opposite. For myself, as an observer, I can say that I visited a number of polling stations in Nairobi. I did speak to presiding officers. I noted that in the fallback mechanisms, the manual mechanisms, the systems that had been put in place, IBC actually did try to increase the number of checks. There are checks that come from observers, their checks that come from presiding officers having to send every 3 hours the number of voters who've cast their votes. So they did try. Whether they succeeded or not, that will await the filing of the petition and the response.
And being argued in court.
One little thing I have to add in that regard. The fallback mechanism, I'm pleased by the approach my friend Ganjama is taking. But the fallback position ought not to have said, if these things fail, let's go back to this kind of manual. They should have been very clear that if the battery, for instance, the life of the battery ends, let's have another battery on standby. If the server fails for one reason, there is a mechanism of having...
I think we are using the wrong approach. One is not a fallback of the other one. It is important to understand
there is something called
that the method that is provided for in law is a method that ultimately gave us the result. These other measures to enhance credibility is actually a measure for purposes of ensuring that the process is credible. But it is not like if you do not transmit the voter using some electronic method, that there would be anything necessarily wrong at the end of the process. One is not a substitute of the other one, but one supplements the electronic transmission of these results. It supplements people's credibility to see that whatever will be coming later, because all these form systems comes later, would appear to be credible because we had received this information prior. And I think that one it is important to emphasize. And it's something that I desire, that as much as possible to ensure that these suspicions are not there. You can imagine smart that since these elections we are saying that they were good elections. Had this transmission system never failed, we could not be having any petitions in the first place, because it was a clear first round. It is only the excuse that something failed that in the first place we are having the petition.
That is not a political
and therefore
statement.
That is why in future I would want this process to work in a credible manner, so that had we received all these results prior to...
But you cannot, he's posing a political opinion, a political preference for a legal, for an analysis. What I'm saying, I think it's important to say this. According to the law, and I will invite my brother to read the law tomorrow with me, the transmission is a requirement, it's mandatory under that law, precisely because of the lessons we learned. We doubted the ability of the human intention to deliver as credibly as possible. But now, we all know, we are all human. We also appreciate that the machines fail. We drive cars which collapse on the road when you are in the, trying to rush to court or something. But if that doesn't happen, then the next, which is the fallback, of having this so-called manual tallying, or is it analog tallying, it must be done with the highest level of integrity and credibility and accountability. And by the way, the participation or a function of the agents and observers is not a convenient thing to do. The Constitution, and the Kibe defender of this Constitution better or stronger than some of us, provides for public participation.
I in particular want to thank my older brother Raila Odinga for his spirited campaign. I know that all candidates have made tremendous personal sacrifices for the progress of our country. And today, I welcome them to join us in moving our nation forward.
This crisis is not just about the IEBC. It's a crisis in the very workings of the faith that Kenyans have placed in their institutions to respect their democratic rights and the rule of law. It is democracy that is on trial.
The same God who gave us victory against the odds
Mungu yule aliyetupa ushindi licha mambo yale mengi
will give or will do
atatenda
exceedingly,
zaidi,
abundantly,
kautende
more than what the people of Kenya want.
When we sing in the words of our national anthem, justice be our shield and defender, haki iwe ngao na mlinzi. If ever there was a time a moment in our country's history where those words sound so relevant, it is now.
All right, welcome back. You're watching KTN Livewire. Let's get back to where this thing really is going. We're all expecting a petition. It's been in the offing for, ever since these results were announced. We're waiting for it. Kibe, it's there. It's somewhere there. It's not a bit far, but it's there somewhere.
Yeah, it's somewhere there. Three things, quick ones. Number one is there has been so much fanfare, so much drama about a legal right, and that a petition is being filed. Personally, whenever there is so much drama and fanfare, quite often I've been underwhelmed that at the end of the day nothing much comes out of it. But that is, we shall see that by tomorrow. Second issue is that I would have hoped that by now there would be one or two tangible things that would be apparent to all Kenyans, reasonable Kenyans, seeing what is wrong with this election. We are being psyched up for a big moment of the petition, but as of now, in the street, there is nothing really that seems to be big. Number two, finally listening to Harun Dubi, and probably what would be the contents of tomorrow's petitions. The failure of technology, which was universal and probably affected everybody equally. The issues of register, those things that ought to have been determined a long time ago, and procurement. I see nothing that, as far as I understand, a big and glorious moment for Kenya like these ones, that would tend to suggest to me that the will of the people, as clearly manifested on the 4th of March, has been impeached by what we are hearing. I hear things like 55% exit polls. You don't know who conducted these exit polls. Something else. Even opinion polls at the highest, when they were giving the Prime Minister 45%. They never gave him 55%. So that I would have expected that when the Prime Minister was called by somebody to be told that exit polls are saying that you have 55%, probably he ought to have asked, and where has this 55 come from? But again, we wait for that tomorrow.
Charles, in the offing, what do you expect in this petition? What are your gut feelings?
I expect legal drama, I expect theatre, I expect the eyes of all Kenyans, the local media, and even the international media to be focused on that Supreme Court room where the trials will be conducted. The Chief Justice, William Mutunga, has already told us that 6 judges will be sitting. That would mean that for the petition by court to succeed, they would need to get a clear affirmative vote of at least 4-2. So I think the court lawyers are very aware of the great task ahead of them to persuade 4 judges to overturn the presidential election result. It is a phenomenon throughout the world that seldom are presidential election petitions successful, not just in African countries where we have a dime a dozen, but even in Western countries. You remember Florida in 2000. So they know that they have a great task ahead, and they have a great team of lawyers who I'm sure have been spending the last week amassing all the evidence that they can. And they'll have a big challenge, because the challenge would be to try and show and impute or impugn the presidential election without impugning the other elections. One of the questions they'll have to answer, I anticipate, from the Supreme Court judges is, if you're saying the systems failed for the presidential election and were the same systems used for the other elections, are you saying that Kenya should go back to elections for all 6 seats all over the country? So they will have to do a distinction between the presidential election and the other elections, and that will be their challenge. I think that they have a team of lawyers who are up to the task. If genuinely the election had problems, they will be able to ferret them out. On the part of Jubilee, they will be using the idea that it is not easy to impugn the presidential election without impugning the others. They will be hoping that they can rely on 33,000 Form 34s to prove their case. So both sides are gearing up for the mother of all legal battles in this country, and I think it will be an interesting one for Kenyans to watch.
Handubi, you surely, you must be on the know of some of these things. Just give us a sneak preview on this petition. You have the rare opportunity to give us an opportunity and let us in into this petition.
It's a studio, not a court registry. But I may say a couple of things. One, the rationale for having a Supreme Court in Kenya was really about the kind of situation they are going to be faced with from tomorrow once these things are filed. Because if it is doing appeals, the Court of Appeal was final at one more time and it would be the final court, just like the Supreme Court would be in ordinary appeals. But this is that one special jurisdiction that the court is going to have to determine whether there is sufficient evidence to be presented before it to alter the apparent result. And I would like to believe that both the parties who are filing their cases plus their lawyers have adequately prepared themselves to be able to show that the election was so polluted as to make that result invalid. And that is what the Constitution says, that it would be declared invalid if the court is satisfied. And I agree with Charles that it is not an easy, it's not a walk in the park. So it's going to be a tough challenge for anybody to do so, but I trust that those lawyers who are going to be doing that work are equal to the task of such a demonstration. The second point is, in these apparent small things that Kibe thinks are too small, they are the very basic contributions that build into a valid election, because having a democratic, a free, fair, transparent, credible election is what safeguards democracy in a country, and therefore the biggest or best insurance for sustainable peace in any country. And I think that therefore the challenge on the failures of IEBC generally in the conduct of all elections, but specifically on the presidential election, is going to be one other issue that will have to be canvassed, and I will not be surprised that in the long term, at the end of it, whether by order of the court or by virtue of what will have come before the court, that there is going to be necessity to thoroughly audit the IEBC and even question, as difficult as that may be, the suitability of the officers and commissioners continuing to serve. But again, I'm saying that carefully because it is founded on the evidence that is available that is going to be presented to court at the right time. The third thing I think is important to say is, even for those who have strong views one way or the other, whether it is me here or Kibe on the other side, it is important to remember that the values of a democratic state, a free and just democratic state, must be protected at every level, whether those values are free and fair elections, credible, transparent, accountable, and all those things. Therefore, it is not important, or rather, whereas it is important to discuss numbers, it is necessary for all of us to accept that apparent manipulation of numbers undermines everything else that we might do around building a democracy. And those are some of the issues that I'm hoping to see to come during the hearing of this petition. But again, like we said earlier, off record, you have your say. I remember saying this off record earlier. This is history in the making. This is the first transitional election we have had from an old, in this new constitution. I am hoping that everybody involved, all stakeholders, will keep this record clearly, so that later on in life, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, those of us, those who will be young adults that time, will come and evaluate our contribution and say who was right in this regard. Did they help build a democracy, a country that we will be proud of?
I was saying this, that even as we gear up to the hearing of this case next week before the Supreme Court, something that is important to emphasize is that we are dealing with a matter of common sense. And that's why the voter who has never gone to school has one vote, and James, smart as he is, he also has a single vote. And therefore, even when those judges sit to be able to determine what was right and what was wrong with these elections, it would be a matter of common sense. The judges will not be trying like to shred and determine that the procurement was good and something like to hair split to decide who is the president of Kenya. This is a simple exercise, and when I talk about something tangible, we mean yesterday's Standard had a very good analysis. For example, and this is actually seems to suggest the views of very many people. When, for example, you do an analysis of the 10 strongholds of Jubilee vis-a-vis an analysis of the 10 counties that support the Code Alliance, you get to a very interesting result. And that result is that on the basis of the votes that they cast, you had a difference of 1 million votes. That becomes very difficult to bridge. And that is where the so-called theory of numbers has to be borne in mind. Again, even when you go to the other least counties where you obtained your votes, again you see a very significant difference between where, for example, the Jubilee candidate got a lot of votes where he's supposed to have gotten the least vis-a-vis the one of CORD. And this is one of the ones that now you point out and you ask, and I've had this conversation with a number of people. If you voted in Kawangware, was that elections okay? I asked one person, said, well, I believe the Prime Minister won in my area, the MP of my choice won in some area. Therefore, if he lost in Kasarani, probably we expected him to lose in Kasarani. And this is the common sense that is repeated across the country, that the result in my area is reflective of how we voted. And that is a common sense that I believe can only suggest one invariable conclusions. It was a good elections minus a probable wrong procurement at some stage.
Okay, common sense here, Charles. What does your common sense tell you that was the will of the people, respected? Is the will of the people shown right now, or the will of the people was, subverted at some point?
Actually, James, that ultimately will be the question that will exercise the minds of the Supreme Court judges. The test that they'll probably set to determine the outcome of the petition will be this simple test. The results that have been announced by IEBC, are they a reasonable reflection, not of the will of the people, but of the will of the voters, of those who registered to vote? Are they a reasonable reflection? Can we see clear and substantial discrepancies that are material enough to put the results of the presidential election as declared by IEBC into question? If they are, then they would be forced to overturn the result of IEBC. If they have a high level of confidence, on the other hand, that they are a fair reflection of the will of the voter, then they will be forced to affirm the outcome of IEBC. So that, you could say, is the 6 billion shilling question, or maybe even the 20 billion shilling question, because there is a possibility if the arguments by CORD succeed and impugn the entire electoral exercise, that would need to do fresh procurement of BVR, fresh procurement of EVID kits, fresh voter registration, fresh vote for all 6 positions. So at the end of the day, this is the 20 or 30 billion shilling question. Was the outcome declared by IEBC a fair reflection of the will of the voters?
And tonight you don't feel sufficiently philanthropic to give us your thoughts.
I'll tell you, Smart, that until I see the petition, I see the grounds that have been put forward by CORD, and I see the responses of Jubilee, I think it would be imprudent to make a suggestion, because based on my first analysis as an observer, it did seem that the result was a fair reflection of the will of the voter. But I don't know what evidence CORD has. I don't know what is the rebuttal of IEBC and of Jubilee. It is only fair to give them an opportunity to file their papers. I'm looking forward to it with a lot of desire. And if you ask me this question in a week's time, barring the sub judice issue, I will already have a sense of where the petition is going.
Okay, I must wind this down. And my final question is, these elections, we put them out, and we all said we are all going to, it's history in the making. We are all, at the junction where we decide our history. We are going to in the next 50 years or so. If I were to wind down 30 seconds for you, do you think we've set a good precedence that in the next 50 years, your children's children would be happy to take these elections and conduct elections in the same way that we've done in the last week?
Well, there were strong points and weak points. There would be weak points that when it came to technology, it was a serious failure. But again, it was a failure across the board. At least we would be able to say that even when technology failed us, at least the legal requirements of what was supposed to be done was actually done and complied with. The second issue that I think we should be proud of is that my big fear was actually that if we get a big turnout, that Kenyan voters will not be able to handle voting for 6 elective positions. They seem to have done reasonably well, and I applaud them. And finally, the other issue that would be important, this is the first general elections and a new constitution. And we see across the country, people are looking up to setting up the counties. I think the counties is one of the major differences that would be there between the old constitutional order and this one. And I think looking 50 years from now and hoping that the counties do a good job, as those of us who wanted devolutions to come to Kenya hope it would, that people now would be proud that there was a first election in which this was possible. And there I believe we are all members of a proud generation. The generation that made it possible. Let's hope that our party will not be spoiled at all by the Supreme Court.
Charles, you must weigh in on this, surely, as you give me your final thoughts. Surely, you can't let that just go.
Yes, I would say that Kenyans were aware that the challenge we faced in 2007-08 was because of lack of confidence in institutions that had not been properly built up, that had not been built up in a bipartisan manner. We built up several institutions from the ground up. One of those was IBC, one of those was New Look Political Parties, the Registrar of Political Parties, and one of those was the Supreme Court that will become the final arbiter of this dispute. What I think, this electoral dispute, what I think is that so far, what Kenyans have done is something that deserves to be admired. And so far, the institutions with hitches and glitches here and there have done their best. Well, I don't want to say IBC have done their best. They could have done better. But at least they have done something to deliver a credible election. The Supreme Court now has the final decision of whether the election was credible or not. I think regardless of which way the Supreme Court decides, when Kenyans look back to this moment 30, 50 years from now, they will say a democracy in Kenya did begin to come of age in 2013.
Quickly, final thoughts. I need to leave.
What I want to say is, you have allowed these guys to take 2 rounds without a combat. And there are 2 men against 1 man here. Anyway,
I don't have not against you, surely.
My point
One
is,
round takes 10 minutes.
my point is that Kenyans set out institutions, they set out structures, and they set out values. I think that one of the institutions that has failed in applying its values and a little bit of the law is the IBC. My verdict on IBC is that if I were given the chance, I would ask them to leave and go, so that Kenyans can have another institution, even if they have to populate it slightly differently and better, having better value judgment system. 2, the Supreme Court that we are going before in a couple of days is a new institution. It's also, in a sense, being tested as to whether it can actually articulate those values vis-a-vis the results that were declared. Because I agree with Charles that what is going to be the issue really is, are these votes the votes that were cast by Kenyan voters, and do they say the same thing? If they do, then they will have to uphold the IEBC result. If they don't, and that's what I think that those who intend to petition are going to say, is that the vote has been manipulated at different levels, including just sheer numbers, as numbers, not anything, just as numbers being thrown there, that will be impugned successfully, and therefore say the Supreme Court will then have to uphold the values of the Constitution, the values of the people in the preamble and everywhere, and say, let's have a fresh election, because that's what it says. I need only to respond to one little point about whether the court can declare an election across board, the 6 elections. We need all to know that each of these elections, much as they were conducted on the same time, almost simultaneously, they are actually separate elections. The petition which I believe will be filed is regarding that one election, irrespective that the evidence and the matters to be canvassed in court may involve all other elections. So for those who are attacking the election of county governors, women representatives, members of the National Assembly or Senate, those are individual petitions regarding each one of those. So it would be wrong for us to make Kenyans believe or start thinking that maybe this thing can bring, can overturn the entire 6 general elections, though that might have been the desire of some.
No, James, let me just clarify. What I meant is that if the Supreme Court rules on the basis of generalized factors like EVID kits, that the Supreme Court, the presidential election result was invalid, that jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, that decision of the Supreme Court would then be used by the losers in all the other areas. We lawyers would have a lot of work, but we would just file petitions and annex the Supreme Court decision saying, look, Supreme Court has ruled, even my election, you need to declare it invalid. I'm not saying that that will happen. What I'm saying is that the court team will have to persuade the Supreme Court to distinguish those factors that affected the presidential election and did not affect the other elections, if they want to avoid an outcome where all elections are subsequently declared invalid.
Gentlemen, I must thank you for your time. Let's do this again when the petition has finally been filed and the judges at least have had some sense of a sitting. Then we can have a better conversation. Well, you're watching KTN Livewire. Thank you very much for talking to us. We've been looking at the election, giving an audit and just filling the gaps where the system worked, where it didn't work, and this conversation never ends. It indeed does continue. I'm James Smart. Sleep well.